More than 200 people watched it happen. Children, teachers, an entire school, standing in a playground in broad daylight, all staring at the same impossible thing in the sky. It should be one of the most famous sightings in the world. Instead, almost no one has ever heard of it. And that is not an accident. Within days, the photographs were confiscated, the film was pulled from the reels, and 2 men walked up to the home of the one teacher who refused to stay quiet and made him an offer that turned a scientist into a liar for the next 30 years. This is Westall. This is the sighting someone tried to erase, and this is everything they took to do it. Start with that teacher, because he is the reason the whole story holds together. His name was Andrew Greenwood, and he was the last man on Earth you would expect to invent a flying saucer. He taught science at Westall High School in Clayton South, a quiet suburb on the southeastern edge of Melbourne, and his entire profession was built on caution. He spent his days telling teenagers not to leap to conclusions. Describe only what you can actually see. Separate the thing itself from the story you want it to be. So when the strange morning came, Greenwood did not reach for a wild answer. He reached, over and over, for an ordinary one. He looked for the balloon. He looked for the trick of the light. He looked for the aircraft. And he kept hunting for that mundane explanation long after the thing in front of him had stopped offering one. Which is what makes the ending so hard to accept. Because this careful, skeptical man, a trained observer who saw it in daylight in front of hundreds of people, would later swear he had imagined the whole thing. He would let them call him a liar. He would go quiet and stay quiet for decades. Why would a scientist do that? Hold that question. The answer arrived at his front door. The morning of Wednesday, the 6th of April, began with nothing at all. Greenwood was inside the science building, teaching a Form 2 class, the windows looking out over the school oval. A normal lesson on a normal day. Then at around 5 minutes to 11, the door of his laboratory flew open. A Form 1 girl who had broken away from her outdoor gym class stood there, and she was not calm. She was shouting. "There were flying saucers outside," she cried. Greenwood's first reaction was not wonder. It was annoyance. A hysterical child had just interrupted his lesson with the single most ridiculous thing a student could say, and his own class was already lost to him, every neck craned toward the windows. He tried to settle them. He tried to pull the room back. Remember that, because it tells you exactly what kind of witness was about to be made. He did not run outside, hoping for a spaceship. He stayed in, irritated, trying to teach. Only when the recess bell rang at 11 did he go out to see for himself, and he went for the most sober reason imaginable. He was the science teacher. Sorting fact from panic was, quite literally, his job. It was not a normal recess. Greenwood stepped outside into open pandemonium. Between 200 and 300 students and staff were spread across the oval and the asphalt, and almost every one of them was staring the same way, toward a stand of pine trees at a neighboring property called The Grange, about 400 meters off. He followed their eyes, and he saw it. A solid object, metallic, highly reflective, shaped like a disc. He would put the color at silver gray, at times silver green, and the size at roughly twice that of a family car. It made no sound, no wings, no fins, no tail, no exhaust, no engine note, no navigation lights, none of the things a lifetime of watching aircraft had trained him to expect. As he stared, the object seemed to thicken, to grow taller, and here the scientist took over. He did not decide it was changing size. He worked out that it was tilting, rolling on its axis to show its wider underside to the crowd below. Even now, he was still trying to explain it away. And then the sky handed him something no balloon could account for. 5 light aircraft, the small planes that flew all day out of nearby Moorabbin Airport, came in and started to circle. They banked. They turned. They tried to close on the silent disc. And what Greenwood saw next was the thing he would carry for the rest of his life. Every time a plane edged near, the object moved, not slowly. It would drift then surge, then simply flick to a new place in the sky, faster than anything he had ever seen, and settle again into a dead hover. The planes looked like they were standing still. For 20 minutes this went on. A silent, impossible chase above a suburban schoolyard, 5 aircraft going after something that treated them as if they were barely moving. He watched it. Hundreds of children watched it. And then, near the end of recess, he looked away for a moment. When he looked back, the sky was empty. The craft was gone. So were all 5 planes, as if the entire morning had been lifted clean out of the air, but it had not left the ground untouched. As recess broke up, the students did what children do. They ran. They climbed the southern fence and poured across the dirt tracks into the Grange, hunting for the thing itself. They did not find it. They found a mark. In the long grass lay a circle about 8 meters across where the grass had been pressed flat and it had not been trampled at random. The blades were swirled, laid down in one single direction, wound around the circle as if something had settled there and turned. One of the students who reached it was a boy named Russell Haynes, and his account matters more than most because of who he became. Haynes went on to serve 32 years in the Victoria Police. Decades later, he described that circle without a flicker of doubt. About 8 meters across, he said, the grass all laid down perfectly in one direction. You cannot argue with facts. It happened. After a lifetime in the force, he said, he knew what he had seen. This was not a story or a memory or a rumor that grew in the retelling. This was a shape in a field that dozens of children stood and stared at with their own eyes. And it is the last piece of hard evidence this story gets to keep, because from here, one by one, the proof starts to vanish. Start with the photographs. A chemistry teacher named Barbara Robbins had gone out with the science department's 35mm camera, and she did the obvious, sensible thing. She aimed it at the hovering disc and took several close shots. Those photographs should exist. They do not. Officials confiscated her camera and her film that same day, and neither the pictures nor the roll were ever seen again. Then there was the television. On the evening of the 6th of April, a crew from Melbourne's Channel 9 reached the school gate and filmed excited students describing what they had seen, until a police officer and a teacher moved the children back inside. That footage aired on the news that night. Years later, researchers went looking for it, and they found the original film canister still sitting in the station's archive. They opened it. The reel was gone. The container was there. The film had simply been removed, and the pattern held everywhere anyone looked. The local paper's own photographer was certain he had taken pictures of the circle in the grass, yet those images were never published and disappeared from the files. Investigators from a Flying Saucer Society reached the site 2 days later, took their own notes and photographs, and those were later reported lost as well. And when the researcher Bill Chalker was finally granted access to the Air Force and Defense files in 1984, hunting for the official record of a sighting witnessed by hundreds of people, he found nothing. Not a report. Not a memo. Not one page. For an event this size, the paper trail did not exist. Someone had made sure of it. Almost. Because one record survived, and it is the reason we can still hear Greenwood in something close to his own words. In 1967, a respected American atmospheric physicist named James McDonald flew to Melbourne for the specific purpose of investigating this case. He sat with Greenwood and interviewed him in detail, and his notes are among the most important early records we have of what the teacher actually said, close to the event, before the decades could bend his memory. It was to McDonald that Greenwood laid out the cat and mouse chase in careful, sober language. A serious scientist crossed the world and took a suburban school teacher seriously enough to write every word down. And this never rested on Greenwood alone. That is what makes Westall so hard to wave away. It is the sheer number of people who stood on that ground and, separately, described the same impossible morning. There was Terry Peck, a student, who remembered exactly how it started, a kid yelling to look up that it was flying saucers, and everyone looking. and it really being one. Peck talked about feeling heat and hearing a buzzing near the site. There was Colin Kelly, who watched the objects lift away on their sides and vanish at what he called an ungodly speed, faster than any aircraft of the day, and who said flatly that there was just no way they were weather balloons. There was Marilyn Eastwood, who climbed the boundary fence with her friend and sat there crying, thinking, in her words, that it was the end of the world. And there was Jeanette Muir, the physical education teacher who was very likely the first adult to see it, already out on the field with her class before the recess crowd ever formed. These were not people trading a rumor. They were scattered across the grounds, watching from different angles, telling the same story. And that is the detail the comfortable explanations can never quite survive. So why has almost no one heard of it? Why is Westall not spoken of the way Roswell is? The answer is that, from the moment the craft vanished, something moved very fast to make certain it would be forgotten, and it started within the hour. The headmaster, Frank Sambleby, a strict and disciplined man, called an emergency assembly of the whole school. He stood in front of hundreds of children who had just watched something extraordinary, and he told them it had not happened. Flying saucers did not exist. It was a weather balloon. It was nonsense. And then came the threat. Any student who kept talking would be punished, even expelled. Any teacher who spoke of it could lose their job. And he did not stand alone. Unbadged men stood beside him at the front of that assembly, some in dark suits, some in dark blue uniforms, and all afternoon the principal's phone rang without stopping, the Air Force on one line, the press on another, while the men worked for hours to seal the whole thing shut. Most of the staff obeyed. Jeanette Muir, the teacher who may have seen it first, went silent and would not speak of it for decades. But Greenwood would not. That same afternoon, against a direct order, he gave his interview to the Dandenong Journal and described exactly what he had seen. And that is what made him a problem, because within days the pressure stopped being about jobs and rules and became something far more personal. 2 men came to his home. One, by his account, was a senior Air Force officer in uniform. The other wore plain clothes. They did not argue. They told him he had seen nothing, that he had made the whole thing up, and that the reason he had made it up was that he had been drunk. Then they told him what would happen if he kept talking. They would write a report, a false one, stating that he suffered from severe alcoholism, and they would send it to the education department, and it would end his career. In his own words, they told him he had not seen anything, that he had made it all up, possibly because he was drunk, and that they would report that fact to the education department, and he would lose his job. And there is your answer. That is why a trained scientist who saw something in daylight, in front of hundreds of witnesses, would spend the next 30 years insisting he had imagined it. Not because he doubted his own eyes, because 2 men had come to his house and made honesty cost him everything. The silence at Westall was never the silence of people who saw nothing. It was the silence of people who had been given a reason to be afraid. Now, honesty cuts both ways, so the ordinary explanations deserve a real hearing, and some of them are genuinely serious. The strongest comes from a researcher named Keith Basterfield, who used Freedom of Information requests to pull declassified files on a joint American and Australian program called Hibble, high-altitude balloons that carried radiation monitoring gear and were run by the Department of Supply. A large silvery balloon rig drifting down could, in theory, look strange. There is also the plain weather balloon. The Age reported the very next day that the Laverton weather station had released one at 8:30 that morning, and that a westerly wind could have carried it over the school. There is a third idea, raised by an Air Force navigator in a letter that April, that what Greenwood described, a round silver object with a rod, was a fair match for a towed target drogue, a windsock used for gunnery practice. And skeptics like Richard Saunders make a real point that no one interviewed these witnesses carefully until roughly 40 years later, leaving room for memory to drift and stories to blend. None of these explanations are stupid, but each one hits the same wall. A drifting balloon does not accelerate away from 5 aircraft. The records that should confirm a Hubal flight on that exact date are missing or redacted. No weather balloon was ever reported lost, and the memory argument struggles against trained observers describing the same thing in April of 1966, long before any legend had time to form. Which leaves the one question no windsock has ever answered. If it was a balloon, why did two men come to a science teacher's home and threaten to destroy him for saying so? 60 years on, Westall is still exactly what it was that morning. An event with hundreds of witnesses and almost no surviving proof, not because the proof never existed, but because so much of it was taken. The photographs are gone. The film canister sits empty. The files are blank. And the people who were children on that oval are in their 70s now, still describing the same silent disc, still certain of what they saw. Andrew Greenwood carried his silence for most of his life, ordered by his own government to deny the evidence of his own eyes, and only near the end did he speak of it again. Whether Westall was a machine from somewhere else or a secret from somewhere much closer to home, one thing is beyond dispute. Someone that day decided that more than 200 people would be made to doubt their own eyes, and for 30 years, it worked. It worked because the story stayed buried, and stories only stay buried when no one repeats them. So if you think 200 witnesses deserve to be believed, that is what the like button is for. It is the single fastest way to push a case like this in front of someone who was never meant to hear it. Subscribe, and you stay with us for the next one, because this was not the only sighting they tried to erase, and we are working through them one by one. And before you go, tell me one thing in the comments. If you had been standing on that oval and two men arrived at your door a week later, would you have stayed quiet, or would you have talked? I read every answer, because the next time authorities tried to bury a sighting, they would not be facing school children. They would be facing an army on an island off the coast of Brazil where the lights did not stay in the sky. They came down into the villages, and they left burns.